So let me begin with the bourgeois and the middle class, then I'll get on to the proles and conclude a bit. Of course, Orwell's question, which is indeed still our question when we think about the middle class, is how can the attainment of creature comforts, respectability, security, and an array of gadgets produce such malaise? Right? Upward mobility, a decent education, the capacity to hold down a good job and be good, move in synchrony with the downward spiral of vitality, hope, and the forces of life here. In this paradox, of course, Orwell diverted his gaze to the preeminent class of the 20th century, a class whose saturated presence on the modern world historical stage not only rendered the working class invisible, but also pushed the elites and their money farther into the equally invisible folds of late capitalist empire, or just late capitalism, while simultaneously dragging men and elites into the comfortable psychic squalor of the middle classes here. I mean, I think it's important to foreground the fact that abjection is not just about dirt. It's about a kind of disconnection, if you want to use the term that James Ferguson does. And the fact that the middle classes are all in front of their television sets, each one of them in front of their own TV set, in each of their rooms, not talking to one another, is a kind of abjection. It's a kind of disconnection here, right? Don't put television sets in your children's rooms. It's a very bad idea. In other words, the 20th century affects a strange class distension, where the immense chasm between the rich and the poor is filled not by the people, but by the lower and upper middle class, the bourgeois and the petit bourgeois, all characterized by their lack of vital human qualities and their lack of political consciousness here. Orwell was outraged not only by the way things were, but by the fact that the middle class was divested of its own rage and quietly accepted and actually came to long for its own imprisonment. There's always a bigger TV to buy, of course. It's the burgeoning middle class of the 20th century that effectively forecloses the very possibility of political consciousness here. Orwell, for whom one's capacity to resist and be outraged functioned as the capstone to one's being, could have only been concerned at that middle class who, as Rita Felsky has noted, was drowning in the accumulated detritus of lower class middle life: stewed pears, portable radios, false teeth, lace curtains, high purchase furniture, teapots, manicure sets, life insurance policies, so on and so forth. Orwell, who made his own furniture, I wrote future, that was fun. Orwell, who made his own furniture, thus performed one of the most thorough autopsies of this revitalized, decentralized, and indeed already dead great class here. So the central focus on the lower middle class in A Clergyman's Daughter, his picture of flying and coming up for air, serves a number of purposes. Politically, the issue is to consider how solidarity might be possible between the working classes and those who stand barely above them in the economic order, as assessed by income and by subordination to relations of production, but are nonetheless convinced by snobbery, in the broad sense, that they have more in common with their betters than with the workers here. This is, at some level, the questions that are posed in The Lion and the Unicorn and the English people. Now, Comstock embraces, as Orwell did himself to some degree, the artistic conceit of failure as his ethically superior position in a corrupt society, but utterly cannot make failure work on its own terms, i.e. transmuted into any kind of success, and is finally compelled to re-embrace the respectability symbolized by the iconic aspidistra, not through any positive sense of reappropriation, but simply as a consciously masochistic form of self-sacrifice to the money god at the end of the world. The break with Ravelston, moreover, as a kind of symbolic type of bourgeois socialism, and there are indeed many Ravelstons still running around on many university campuses, does not create the basis for an alternative form of solidarity, but simply leaves the lower middle class drifting and unmoored. What the protagonists of both novels are seeking at a certain level is a whale, to shelter inside, to borrow the image that Orwell, of course, used with Henry Miller, a place of quiet where the pressures of the world, in their case, unlike Miller's, above all the pressures of middle-class respectability, can be dampened by a thick layer of blubber. Orwell criticized Miller's radically apolitical stance in its own terms, and I think this criticism resonates with the narrative dead ends which Rosemary and Gordon find themselves. In other words, we shouldn't consider these books failures because of the cheap endings. He's orchestrating something that I think returns with the piece on Henry Miller and The Whale. There's another type of whale that he's already kind of examined in that. It's no accident, then, that the working class is entirely absent from So the underclass of the British in part of down and out in Paris and London suddenly and rather artificially pops up in the hot-picking section of A Clergyman's Daughter, but they don't exist in this text very much yet. Whether or not Orwell deliberately engineered this structural absence as a literary device, the evidence suggests that he did not. It's profoundly significant that the sharpest, most desolate form of the middle class dilemma flourishes in a social space from which the worker, as a concrete social being, rather than an abstract category of bourgeois snobbery, is entirely missing. Coming up for air is a bit different in this respect. Bowling's ideal worker is freer than Bowling himself because he does not aspire to the middle class accoutrement, including specifically a mortgage, by which the middle class are entrapped both financially and imaginatively. Biographically, it's fairly clear that this difference corresponds to a shift in Orwell's thinking, coming after the decisive break represented by the road to Wigan Pier and the March to Catalonia, which clarified Orwell's politics as well as his literary purposes. Fictionally and politically, it is, however, remarkable that this shift, again, whether or not Orwell engineered it or not, takes the form of the entrance of the concrete worker into the middle class imagination, right? And this is the key motive that is established by the line in the court. However, one would hardly expect a purely imaginative connection, and a one-sided one at that. The worker's view of George Bowling is entirely absent from this novel. We don't know what workers think about George. It's absent and it's not sufficient to establish a social, political, or even moral solidarity. There's no people, if you follow the definition of the people that I'm using with Orwell here. Indeed, what enables Bowling to avoid drowning entirely in soul-dead respectability, unlike ultimately both Dorothy Hare and Gordon Comstock, is apparently entirely non-political. The escape back to the golden age of childhood that can still be recaptured, at least imaginatively.